An orphan girl storms into a courtroom, tears in her eyes, and pleads with the judge, "I'm starving, can you help me?" The room falls silent, stunned by her desperation. The judge, a stern and unyielding man, dismisses her, only for her to collapse at his feet. As the bailiff rushes to help, a tattered letter spills from her belongings, addressed to the judge himself. It's a connection no one saw coming. What secrets does this letter hold? And will this encounter lead to salvation or heartbreak? When a child's cry for help shatters his world, how far will he go to make things right? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The growling in Rose's stomach had become unbearable. She pressed her small hand against it, trying to quiet the angry rumbles that echoed through her tiny bedroom in the foster home. The 7-year-old hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, another punishment from her foster mother for spilling a glass of milk. Moonlight filtered through her window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Rose's eyes fell on the worn backpack in the corner, the only thing she had left from her mother. Making up her mind, she grabbed it and carefully stuffed in her few treasures: a sketchbook, some colored pencils, and the faded photo of her mom. "I can't stay here anymore," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling but determined. Her foster mother's snores echoed from down the hall as Rose crept down the creaky stairs. Each step felt like thunder in her ears, but she kept going, driven by hunger and desperation. The city streets were cold and uninviting in the early evening. Neon signs buzzed overhead, and the occasional car whooshed past, spraying puddles onto the sidewalk. Rose hugged her thin jacket closer, her backpack bouncing against her spine as she walked. Her stomach cramped painfully, reminding her why she had to leave. She peered into restaurant windows, watching people eat their dinners. But when she tried to enter, the hosts would shoo her away with suspicious looks. "No unaccompanied children," they'd say, or simply point to the door without a word. In a narrow alley, Rose found a half-eaten sandwich in a paper bag, but a large rat scared her away before she could grab it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. Her mother had always said crying wouldn't solve problems. Action would. As darkness settled over the city, Rose's feet ached from walking. She was about to sink down onto a doorstep when she spotted it, a massive building with warm lights glowing from its windows. Unlike the harsh neon of the restaurants, these lights seemed to promise safety. The word courthouse was carved in stone above its doors. Rose's heart beat faster as she climbed the wide stone steps. Through the heavy doors, she found herself in a quiet hallway lined with wooden benches. Following the sound of voices, she came to a pair of tall doors. Her small hands pushed them open before she could lose her courage. The courtroom fell silent. Dozens of faces turned to stare at her. Men in suits, women with briefcases, police officers standing guard. At the front of the room, seated high above everyone else, was Judge Henry Whitaker. His stern face and black robes might have scared Rose on any other day, but hunger made her brave. "Young lady," Judge Whitaker's deep voice boomed across the courtroom, "this is a court of law. You cannot simply—" "I'm starving," Rose interrupted, her voice small but clear in the hushed room. "Can you help me?" Judge Whitaker's bushy eyebrows drew together as he studied the tiny figure before him. Rose stood her ground, her backpack clutched tight against her chest, her clothes wrinkled and dirty from her journey through the city. Her brown eyes met his directly, filled with a mixture of hope and desperation that seemed far too mature for her young face. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for the judge's response. Henry Whitaker was known for his strict adherence to protocol and his no-nonsense approach to maintaining order in his courtroom. But something in the girl's steady gaze made him pause, his gavel suspended mid-air. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Judge Henry Whitaker's face darkened. He had presided over thousands of cases, but never had anyone dared to interrupt his proceedings so boldly, even if that someone was just a small, disheveled child. "This is completely inappropriate," he declared, his voice stern and unwavering. "Bailiff, please remove—" Before he could finish his sentence, Rose's knees buckled. Her tiny body crumpled to the floor like a rag doll, her backpack spilling open as she fell. The bailiff rushed forward, his heavy boots echoing against the marble floor as concerned gasps filled the air. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted from the gallery. As the bailiff gently lifted Rose's unconscious form, papers and drawings scattered across the polished floor. Among them, a weathered envelope caught Henry's eye. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the handwriting, the same elegant script that had graced countless birthday cards and letters throughout his childhood. "Sarah," he whispered, his sister's name catching in his throat. With trembling hands, Henry descended from the bench, his black robe sweeping behind him. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as their normally stoic judge knelt to retrieve the envelope. It was addressed simply, "To my dear brother Henry." "Your Honor?" the bailiff questioned, still cradling Rose. "My chambers now," Henry ordered, his voice hoarse. He turned to the packed courtroom. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." Inside his office, Rose lay on the leather sofa while a paramedic checked her vital signs. "Severe dehydration and malnutrition," the medical professional reported. "She needs proper care and supervision." Henry barely heard him. He sat at his desk, staring at the letter he'd extracted from the envelope. His sister's words, written 5 years ago, blurred before his eyes. "Dearest Henry, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I know we haven't spoken since that terrible fight, and my heart breaks knowing we never made peace, but I need your help one last time. My daughter, Rose, has no one else. You're her only family now. Please don't let your anger at me keep you from loving her. She has so much of me in her, especially her art. Remember how you used to love my paintings? With eternal love and hope for forgiveness as Sarah." The paper crinkled in Henry's grip as memories flooded back. The argument about Sarah's art career, his harsh words about her wasting her life, the slam of a door that would never open again. He'd been too proud to reach out, too stubborn to apologize, and now— "Your Honor," the bailiff interrupted gently. "Child Services is on their way, but given the circumstances—" Henry looked at Rose's small form on his sofa. Her face, even in unconsciousness, held echoes of Sarah, the same delicate features, the same determined set of her jaw, his niece, the daughter of the sister he'd failed. "No," he said quietly, then cleared his throat. "No child services. I'll take temporary guardianship. It's my responsibility." The words felt foreign in his mouth, and his stomach churned with uncertainty. What did he know about caring for a child? His life was ordered, predictable, solitary, exactly how he liked it. But as he watched Rose's chest rise and fall, Henry knew he had no choice. He owed Sarah this much, even if the thought of it terrified him. "Get me the necessary paperwork," he told the bailiff, his voice gruff with emotion. "And find out which foster home she ran from. I want to know everything." The drive to Henry's home was silent, broken only by the soft hum of the car's engine and Rose's occasional sniffles. After being cleared by the doctors, Henry had reluctantly guided her to his black sedan, her small backpack clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. When they pulled up to the 3-story Victorian house, Rose's eyes widened. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its perfectly manicured lawn and precise hedges reflecting the same rigid order as its owner. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Henry replied curtly, leading her up the stone path. "Watch your step." Inside, the house was immaculate. Everything gleamed with polish: the hardwood floors, the mahogany furniture, the brass fixtures. But there were no family photos on the walls, no comfortable clutter, no sign that anyone actually lived here. It felt more like a museum than a home. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right," Henry said, checking his watch. "I have some work to review. The kitchen is through there if you're hungry. Please try not to disturb anything." Rose nodded, clutching her backpack tighter. "Thank you, Judge Whitaker." "You may call me Henry," he said stiffly, already turning toward his study. Rose climbed the stairs slowly, her shoes squeaking against the polished wood. Her new room was like everything else in the house, perfect and impersonal. The bed was made with hospital corners, the desk was bare, and the walls were a stark white. After putting away her few belongings, Rose ventured back downstairs. She found Henry in his study, surrounded by legal papers. "Henry," she tried, "maybe we could talk?" He barely looked up. "I'm quite busy at the moment." "Oh." Rose shifted from foot to foot. "I just thought, maybe you could tell me about my mom, since you're her brother and all." Henry's pen stopped moving. "That's not a topic for discussion." Disappointed but not deterred, Rose began exploring the living room. In a corner cabinet, partially hidden behind leather-bound books, she spotted a dusty wooden box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Her small fingers carefully lifted one showing a younger Henry with his arm around a woman who looked just like her. "Mom," she breathed, touching the woman's face. "What are you doing?" Rose jumped at Henry's sharp voice. He stood in the doorway, his face thunderous. "I'm sorry. I just found these pictures and—" "Those are private." Henry strode forward and snatched the box away. "This is exactly why I don't want children in my home. No respect for boundaries or personal property." Tears welled in Rose's eyes. "I just wanted to see my mom," she whispered. "Go to your room," Henry ordered, his voice shaking. "Now." Rose fled upstairs, her small feet pounding against the steps as sobs escaped her throat. The sound of her crying echoed through the empty house, each sob like a hammer against Henry's heart. He sank into his armchair, the box of photos heavy in his lap. The top picture, the one Rose had been holding, showed Sarah at her art school graduation. She was beaming at the camera, her whole life ahead of her, a life he had dismissed as foolish and impractical. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his fingers tracing his sister's face. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." Upstairs, Rose's muffled crying continued, each sob a reminder of his failure, both to his sister and now to her daughter. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the flour-dusted counters. Rose stood on a chair she'd dragged from the dining room, her small face scrunched in concentration as she flipped what was supposed to be a pancake. The kitchen looked like a war zone, eggshells scattered across the counter, a splash of milk pooling on the floor, and a fine coating of flour covering nearly every surface. Henry's footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing closer. Rose held her breath as he appeared in the doorway, still in his navy blue robe. His eyes widened at the chaos. "What in heaven's name?" "I made breakfast," Rose announced, trying to sound cheerful despite her nervousness. "Well, I tried to. The pancakes are a little funny looking." Henry's jaw tightened as he surveyed the mess. "This is completely unacceptable. Look at this disaster." He gestured at the flour-covered counters. "There are rules in this house, young lady. Rules about cleanliness and order." Rose's shoulders slumped. "I just wanted to do something nice," she mumbled, climbing down from the chair. "Mom always said breakfast was the best way to start a day." Henry opened his mouth to deliver another lecture, but something stopped him. On the plate beside the stove sat 3 misshapen pancakes, arranged in a wobbly, smiley face. Despite himself, he felt a twinge of something. Appreciation? Guilt? "Just clean this up before you leave for school," he said, his voice softer than intended. "I'll help you." After breakfast and cleanup, Rose found herself with time to explore while Henry made some work calls. The house was full of closed doors and quiet rooms, like a giant puzzle waiting to be solved. In a dusty corner of the upstairs study, she discovered an old wooden chest. Inside, beneath some blankets, lay a leather case. Her heart skipped when she opened it. Art supplies, dozens of pencils, charcoals, and pastels, all neatly arranged. Some looked unused, while others were worn down to stubs. Next to them was a sketchbook filled with drawings signed Sarah W. Rose's fingers trembled as she touched the pages. Her mother's drawings. She'd inherited more than just her looks from Sarah. The urge to create, to draw, ran in her blood. Taking a fresh piece of paper from the sketchbook, Rose began to draw. Time melted away as she worked, her small hands moving with surprising confidence. When Henry called her for dinner, she carefully tucked the drawing into her pocket. At the dinner table, as Henry mechanically cut his meat into precise squares, Rose gathered her courage. "I found something today," she said quietly, pulling out the folded paper. I made this for you. Henry took the paper with reluctance, but when he unfolded it, his fork clattered to his plate. Staring back at him was Sarah's face, captured in simple yet striking lines. Rose had drawn her smiling, just as she appeared in the photograph from yesterday. But there was something more. A warmth, a life that photographs couldn't capture. How did you... Henry's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. Where did you learn to draw like this? I've always drawn stuff, Rose said, pushing her peas around her plate. Mom could draw too, couldn't she? I saw her sketchbook upstairs. Henry nodded, still staring at the drawing. His fingers traced the lines of his sister's smile, and for the first time since Rose had arrived, his stern expression softened. Yes, he said quietly. She was very talented, just like you. Rose sat quietly on the wooden bench outside Henry's courtroom, her small legs swinging back and forth. The courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers in crisp suits hurrying past, their briefcases swinging, and worried-looking people waiting for their turn before the judge. Henry had brought her along, muttering something about not trusting her alone at home after the kitchen incident. A gentle humming caught her attention. Down the hallway, an older woman pushed a cleaning cart, her silver-streaked black hair tied back in a neat bun. She wore a blue uniform with a name tag that read, Maria. Unlike the rushed crowds around her, Maria moved with unhurried purpose, stopping to wipe down each wooden bench with care. When she reached Rose's bench, Maria's warm brown eyes crinkled with a smile. Hello there, Pequeña. Are you waiting for someone? Rose nodded. Judge Whitaker, he's my... She paused, unsure how to explain their complicated situation. I'm staying with him for now. Ah, Judge Whitaker. Maria's smile widened. He likes everything just so, doesn't he? She gestured at the spotless bench. 20 years I've worked here, and he's the only judge who notices if I miss a spot. Rose giggled, then reached into her backpack and pulled out her latest drawing, a sketch of the courthouse's grand entrance. I like to draw while I wait, she explained. Maria's eyes lit up as she studied the drawing. Dios mío, such talent. She sat down beside Rose, her cleaning cart momentarily forgotten. You know, art saved my life once. Rose leaned forward, intrigued. Really? How? When I first came to this country, I had nothing but hope and determination, Maria said, her voice soft with memory. My children were small like you. Times were hard. But every night I would draw with them. Silly pictures, happy scenes we dreamed of. Those drawings kept our spirits alive. Inside the courtroom, Henry called for a brief recess. As he stepped into the hallway, he paused at the sight of Rose and Maria deep in conversation. Something about the scene made his chest tighten. The way Rose's face glowed with interest, how freely she smiled. Judge Whitaker? Maria stood respectfully, but her eyes held a gentle challenge. Your little artist here has quite a gift. Henry shifted uncomfortably. Yes. Well, she seems to have inherited that from her mother. Gifts like these need nurturing, Maria said firmly. They're not just hobbies, they're lifelines. She reached into her cart and pulled out a leather-bound sketchbook, well worn, but still beautiful. My youngest is in art school now. She left this behind, but I think it needs a new home. Rose's eyes widened as Maria handed her the sketchbook. Are you sure? Art can heal even the deepest wounds, Maria said softly, her gaze moving between Rose and Henry. Sometimes it helps us say things our hearts are too scared to speak. Henry watched as Rose hugged the sketchbook to her chest, her eyes shining with joy. For a moment, he saw Sarah in her expression, that same pure delight in creating beauty from blank pages. Maria's words echoed in his mind, gently prodding at walls he'd built years ago. Thank you, Rose whispered to Maria, who squeezed her shoulder gently. De nada, pequeña. Remember, every blank page is a new beginning. Maria picked up her cleaning supplies, but before returning to work, she turned to Henry. Judge, Sometimes the most important cases aren't the ones we hear in court, but the ones that come knocking at our hearts. Over the next few weeks, Rose's artwork began appearing throughout Henry's once austere home. Bright crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator, held by magnets that hadn't seen use in years. Watercolor paintings dried on newspaper sheets spread across the kitchen table. Even the hallway leading to their bedrooms now hosted an impromptu gallery of sketches. Henry found himself pausing each morning to study Rose's latest creations. There was something captivating about watching his house transform, as if each new piece of art breathed life into the empty spaces he'd grown accustomed to. One evening after dinner, Henry sat at the dining room table reviewing case files when he heard Rose's frustrated sigh from across the room. She sat surrounded by math worksheets, her forehead creased in concentration. "Is everything all right?" he asked, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. Rose looked up, biting her lower lip. "It's these fraction problems. They don't make sense." Henry hesitated, then closed his case file. "Would you like some help?" Rose's face lit up. "Really?" He moved to sit beside her, picking up her pencil. "Let's see what we're dealing with." As he explained the concepts, breaking them down into simpler terms, he found himself impressed by how quickly Rose grasped each new idea. Her eyes sparkled with understanding as she solved problem after problem. "You're quite good at this," Henry remarked, watching her work through a particularly challenging question. "My mom used to say fractions are like mixing paint," Rose said softly. "You need the right amounts to make the perfect color." Henry felt the familiar pang whenever Rose mentioned her mother, but this time it was mixed with something else. Pride in how Rose had transformed that loss into understanding. Later that evening, while Rose was getting ready for bed, Henry noticed a new painting propped against the wall in the living room. Unlike her other works, this one was larger, painted on proper canvas from the art supplies Maria had given her. The painting showed 3 figures standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like his own. He recognized Rose's self-portrait immediately. She'd captured her own curly hair and bright smile perfectly. Next to her stood a woman with angel wings, clearly meant to be her mother watching from heaven. But what made Henry's throat tighten was the third figure, a tall man in a judge's robes standing protectively beside Rose, his stern expression softened by a hint of a smile. Henry stared at the painting, his vision blurring slightly. He reached out to touch the canvas gently, tracing the careful brushstrokes that had transformed him from merely Rose's temporary guardian into something more meaningful, a father figure in her imagined family. "Do you like it?" He turned to find Rose in her pajamas, watching him nervously from the doorway. Henry's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You made me smile in the painting." "Because you do smile sometimes now," Rose said simply. "Even if you try to hide it." Henry looked back at the painting, at the family Rose had created on canvas, the family she wished for. For the first time since his sister's death, he allowed himself to imagine what it might mean to truly be someone's family again. The thought both terrified and moved him in ways he hadn't expected. Rose's small hand slipped into his, and together they stood looking at her vision of what they could be. The painting seemed to ask a question that Henry had been avoiding since the day Rose burst into his courtroom. What was his real role in this child's life? The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the study windows as Rose explored the dusty room. Henry had finally agreed to let her help clean it out, though he'd been reluctant at first. She found the task exciting, like a treasure hunt through history. Behind a stack of old law books, Rose discovered a cardboard box filled with manila folders. Each one contained case files from Henry's years as a judge. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she began leafing through them carefully. One particular file caught her eye. The name Jonathan Miller stood out in bold type. Rose's heart skipped a beat. That was her father's name. With trembling hands, she opened the folder and began to read. The legal language was difficult to understand, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Art forgery, fraudulent paintings, sentenced to 8 years. Dates, locations, and details swam before her eyes. This was her father's trial, and Henry had been the judge who sent him to prison. Rose felt like she couldn't breathe. The room suddenly seemed too small, too confined. She clutched the file to her chest and ran downstairs to where Henry sat in his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper. "You knew," Rose's voice cracked as she thrust the file toward him. "You knew about my dad all along." Henry lowered his newspaper, his face paling as he recognized the folder in Rose's hands. "Rose, Did you know who I was when I came into your courtroom that day?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Is that why you took me in? Because you felt guilty?" Henry set his newspaper aside and stood up slowly, his expression grave. "No, Rose. I didn't make the connection until just now." He reached for the file, but Rose pulled it away. "My dad wasn't a bad person," she said, her voice trembling. "He only wanted to help my mom when she got sick. We needed money for her treatments." Henry's shoulders sagged as the weight of this revelation settled over him. He remembered the case clearly now. Jonathan Miller, a talented artist who had turned to forgery out of desperation. The evidence had been irrefutable, the law clear. But now, looking at Rose's tear-stained face, the black and white certainty of that decision blurred into shades of gray. "The law required a minimum sentence," Henry explained softly. "Your father committed a serious crime, regardless of his intentions." "After he went to prison, Mom got worse," Rose continued, anger and hurt mixing in her voice. "She couldn't take care of me anymore. That's why I ended up in foster care. That's why I was hungry and alone that day in your courtroom." Henry felt as if each word was a physical blow. His decisions as a judge had always seemed clear-cut, justified by law and precedent. But now he saw how his ruling had created ripples that touched lives in ways he'd never considered. Rose's life in particular. "I was just doing my job," he whispered. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Rose stared at him, her brown eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. The trust they'd built over the past weeks seemed to crumble between them. She backed away from him, still clutching the file. "Your job ruined my family," she said quietly, before turning and running up the stairs. Henry remained rooted to the spot, the sound of Rose's bedroom door slamming echoing through the house. For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning whether justice served had truly been justice at all. Maria found Henry in his chambers during lunch break, her determination evident in her purposeful stride. "Judge Whitaker, there's an art exhibition this weekend at the community center. I think it would do both you and Rose some good to go." Henry glanced up from his paperwork, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "I don't think that's appropriate right now, Maria. Things are complicated." "That's exactly why you should go," Maria insisted, her warm brown eyes filled with wisdom. "Art has a way of healing hearts, especially broken ones." Henry sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. The past few days had been tense, with Rose barely speaking to him during meals. The weight of their shared past hung heavy between them. "Fine," he conceded. "I'll ask her." That Saturday afternoon, Henry and Rose walked through the community center's transformed gymnasium. Paintings of various sizes adorned temporary walls, while sculptures dotted the open spaces. Rose's eyes lit up at the explosion of colors and creativity around her, momentarily forgetting her anger toward Henry. "Mom used to paint like that," Rose said softly, pointing to a landscape piece with bold, sweeping brushstrokes. It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother since discovering the case file. She loved using bright colors, especially when she wasn't feeling well. She said it made the world less gray. Henry listened intently, noting how Rose's face came alive when speaking about her mother. As they moved through the exhibition, Rose shared more memories. Her mother teaching her to mix colors, the smell of oil paints in their small apartment, the way her mother would hum while working at her easel. "Did you say Miller?" A voice interrupted their conversation. They turned to find a well-dressed woman with silver hair studying them intently. "I'm Eleanor Brighton, the gallery owner. Are you perhaps related to Sarah Miller?" Rose's eyes widened. "That was my mom." Eleanor's face softened with recognition. "Sarah was an incredible talent. We featured her work in our spring showcase about 8 years ago. Her use of color was revolutionary. She had such a promising future ahead of her." "You knew my mom?" Rose's voice quivered with excitement. Do you still have any of her paintings? We have 2 pieces in storage, Eleanor replied, watching as Rose's face lit up. Would you like to see them sometime? Henry observed the interaction, seeing Rose in a new light. He'd known she was artistic, but he hadn't realized she was carrying on such a meaningful legacy. Rose is an artist too, he found himself saying, surprising both himself and Rose. She's quite talented. Eleanor turned to Rose with interest. Do you have any of your work with you? Rose hesitated, then pulled her ever-present sketchbook from her backpack. With trembling hands, she showed Eleanor her recent drawings. Eleanor examined each page carefully, her expression growing increasingly impressed. These are remarkable for someone your age. You have your mother's eye for detail. She looked up at Henry. Would you consider letting us display one of Rose's pieces in our youth artist corner? We feature promising young talents there. Rose's breath caught, and for the first time in days, she looked at Henry with something other than hurt in her eyes. There was hope there, and a silent plea. Henry felt something shift inside him as he watched Rose practically vibrating with anticipation. He saw not just the girl he'd taken in, but Sarah Miller's daughter, an artist in her own right, carrying forward her mother's creative spirit despite all the hardships life had thrown at her. Of course, he said softly. I think that would be wonderful. Rose's face broke into a radiant smile, the first real one he'd seen since the discovery of the case file. Eleanor began discussing which piece to display, while Rose eagerly flipped through her sketchbook. In the quiet evening hours, Rose sat cross-legged on the floor of her room, surrounded by art supplies. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated on the canvas before her, carefully mixing colors on a palette Henry had bought her. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow over her workspace, making the colors seem even more vibrant. Down the hall in his study, Henry sat at his desk, the yellowed case file open before him. His fingers traced the typed words that detailed the arrest and conviction of James Miller, Rose's father, for art forgery. The evidence had been clear: multiple counts of forging famous paintings and selling them to unsuspecting collectors. The sentence he'd handed down was fair by any legal standard: 8 years. But now, looking at the photographs attached to the file, Henry saw more than just a criminal case. He saw a family torn apart. Sarah Miller, Rose's mother, had fallen ill shortly after her husband's imprisonment. Without proper support and medical care, she'd passed away, leaving Rose alone in the system. The weight of these connections pressed heavily on Henry's chest. He closed the file and made his way to the courthouse kitchen where Maria was finishing her evening cleaning routine. I can't stop thinking about it, Maria, Henry admitted, his usually commanding voice soft and uncertain. If I hadn't sentenced him. Maria set down her cleaning supplies and faced him directly. Judge Whitaker, you did your job. The law is the law, and he broke it. But look what happened to Rose because of my decision. Henry's voice cracked slightly. Maria's eyes softened with understanding. Life gave you a second chance with that little girl. Instead of dwelling on what you can't change, focus on what you can do now. Henry leaned against the counter, considering Maria's words. She's so talented, Maria, just like her mother was. When I see her drawing, it's like she goes to another world, a happier one. Then help her build that world, Maria said simply. She needs you now, not your guilt. Back at home, Henry paused outside Rose's room. The door was partially open, and he could see her working intently on her canvas. Her small face was serious with concentration, reminding him of the determined look she'd worn when she first burst into his courtroom. Rose looked up, catching his eye. Instead of turning away as she had been doing since finding the case file, she gestured for him to come in. Want to see? She asked hesitantly. Henry entered slowly, careful not to disturb any of her art supplies. The painting before her took his breath away. It showed a park scene filled with sunshine and vibrant colors. In the center stood 2 figures, a small girl with a paintbrush and a tall man in what was unmistakably a judge's robe. They were holding hands, and both were smiling. Is that... Henry's voice trailed off. Rose nodded, adding a final stroke of yellow to the sun. It's us. Well, how I wish us could be. She paused, biting her lip. I know you didn't mean to hurt my family when you sent my dad away. You were just doing your job. Henry knelt beside her, his heart full of emotion he couldn't quite express. Rose, It's okay, she interrupted, pointing to the painting. See how bright the colors are? Mom always said that meant hope. There's still lots of hope for us, right? Henry looked at the painting again, seeing it through new eyes, the careful brush strokes, the hopeful symbolism, the future it represented. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself and to Rose that he would do everything in his power to make that painted dream a reality. The spring morning dawned crisp and clear as Henry drove Rose to Henderson Park. He couldn't remember the last time he'd visited this place, though memories of bringing his sister here decades ago flickered at the edges of his mind. Rose pressed her face against the car window, her eyes wide with excitement at the sight of the playground equipment gleaming in the morning sun. Can I really play as long as I want? She asked, bouncing slightly in her seat. Henry's lips curved into a small smile. Within reason. Yes. The moment he parked, Rose burst from the car like a butterfly freed from its cocoon. She paused at the playground's edge, looking back at Henry with uncertainty. He nodded encouragingly, and she rushed toward the swings where other children were already playing. Henry settled onto a nearby bench, his posture gradually relaxing as he watched Rose introduce herself to two girls her age. Within minutes, they were playing an elaborate game that seemed to involve the swing set being a pirate ship. Rose's laughter carried across the playground, clear and bright as a bell. Higher, she called to one of her new friends who was pushing her on the swing. I want to touch the clouds. Something warm and unfamiliar spread through Henry's chest as he watched her. Pride, he realized with surprise. He was proud of how easily she made friends, how resilient she was despite everything she'd been through. The feeling caught him off guard, and he found himself smiling without meaning to. After an hour of playing, Rose came running over, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Can we have our picnic now? I'm starving. They settled under a large oak tree, spreading out the simple lunch Henry had packed. Rose bit into her sandwich with gusto, then looked at Henry thoughtfully. Did you come here when you were little? She asked between bites. Henry paused, memories washing over him. Yes, actually. My sister Catherine and I used to spend whole afternoons here. Rose's eyes lit up at this rare mention of his sister. What was she like? Henry was quiet for a moment, smoothing the picnic blanket. She was full of life, always laughing, always creating something. She loved to dance right here under this tree. He pointed upward at the branches swaying gently in the breeze. She'd say the leaves were clapping for her. Just like in the photo I found, Rose said softly. The one where she's twirling in a yellow dress. Henry nodded, his throat tight. That's right. What happened to her? Rose asked, her voice gentle. Henry's hands tensed slightly. She got very sick very quickly. I was away at law school when... He trailed off, unable to continue. Rose reached over and placed her small hand on his. It's okay. You don't have to tell me everything right now. Her simple gesture of comfort touched something deep within Henry. He looked at this little girl who had burst into his courtroom and, subsequently, into his life. She'd shown him more understanding in a few weeks than he'd shown himself in years. As they packed up their picnic and headed toward the car, Rose skipping slightly ahead, Henry made a decision. He caught up to her and knelt down to meet her eyes. Rose, he said seriously, I want you to know something. I promise I will always do everything in my power to protect you. You're safe with me. Rose's eyes welled up with tears, but she was smiling. She threw her arms around his neck in a tight hug. For the first time, Henry didn't stiffen at the contact. Instead, he hugged her back, realizing that in protecting her, he might finally begin to heal himself. The morning mail arrived as usual, a neat stack that Henry's secretary had placed on his desk at the courthouse. Among the legal documents and court notices lay a cream-colored envelope addressed to Rose, care of Judge Henry Whitaker. The handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, as if written by an elderly hand. Henry studied the envelope with narrowed eyes. Rose rarely received mail, and any correspondence related to her case typically went through official channels. His judicial instincts, honed over decades on the bench, told him something wasn't quite right. He carefully opened the envelope, justifying the action as his duty as Rose's guardian. Inside, he found 2 items, a letter and a small velvet pouch. The letter was written on expensive stationery, the same cream color as the envelope. "My dearest Rose," it began. "You don't know me, but I am your grandmother, Eleanor Matthews. I have spent years searching for you, and my heart soared when I learned you were safe with Judge Whitaker." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. Eleanor explained how she had distanced herself from Rose's mother years ago due to family conflicts, a decision she deeply regretted. She described watching her daughter's artistic career from afar, too proud to reach out and mend their relationship. From the velvet pouch, Henry withdrew a delicate silver brooch shaped like a paintbrush. His breath caught as he recognized it from photos of Rose's mother. She had worn it in nearly every gallery opening, considering it her lucky charm. "This brooch," the letter continued, "was your mother's most treasured possession. I gave it to her on her 16th birthday, and now I want you to have it. It represents not just your mother's artistic legacy, but also my hope for a chance to know my only granddaughter." Henry set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had assumed, as had everyone else, that Rose had no living relatives. Her case file listed her grandmother as deceased. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, along with an undeniably authentic family heirloom. He picked up his phone and dialed his most trusted private investigator. Within hours, he had confirmation. Eleanor Matthews was very much alive, living in a wealthy suburb just 2 hours away. She had indeed been Rose's maternal grandmother, and her story checked out. After a falling out with her daughter over her career choice, Eleanor had essentially disappeared from public life, becoming somewhat of a recluse. The investigator's report included a recent photo of Eleanor, an elegant woman in her 70s, with the same artistic sensitivity in her features that Rose possessed. The resemblance was unmistakable. Henry stood at his office window, watching the courthouse square below as he wrestled with what to do. Rose was finally settling into a stable life. She was making friends at school, excelling in her art classes, and beginning to trust in her place in his home. The thought of disrupting that peace made his stomach churn. Yet he couldn't shake the image of Rose working on her paintings, constantly asking questions about her mother's art. How many times had he seen her studying old gallery photos, trying to piece together her family history? The brooch in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. If he told Rose about Eleanor, it could open old wounds and create new complications. If he didn't, he would be denying her the chance to know her only living relative, and denying her grandmother the opportunity to make amends. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical burden. Henry carefully placed the brooch and letter in his desk drawer, locking it with a decisive click. He needed time to think, to determine the best course of action for Rose's sake. But the knowledge of Eleanor's existence would haunt his thoughts, challenging his certainty about what it truly meant to protect the child who had become so precious to him. The morning sun cast long shadows across Henry's study as he helped Rose adjust her dress collar. Her small fingers fidgeted with the hem of her new blue dress, betraying her nervousness about meeting Eleanor for the first time. "Remember," Henry said gently, kneeling to meet her eyes, "you don't have to say or do anything you don't want to. I'll be right there with you." Rose nodded, her usual sparkle dimmed by anxiety. "What if she doesn't like me?" Henry's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "Anyone who doesn't like you needs their head examined," he said, earning a small giggle from Rose. They drove to the elegant tea room Eleanor had chosen for their meeting. The place was all crystal chandeliers and fancy tablecloths, exactly the kind of establishment that made Rose feel out of place. As they approached their reserved table, Eleanor stood to greet them. She cut an impressive figure in her tailored suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. But it was her eyes that caught Rose's attention. They were the same shade of green as her own, a detail that made her catch her breath. "Rose," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the polish of years in high society, You look so much like your mother." She reached out as if to touch Rose's cheek but stopped short when Rose instinctively stepped closer to Henry. They sat down, and Eleanor launched into carefully prepared speeches about regret and lost time. "I should have been there for you," she said, her words precise and measured. "After your mother chose her art career over the path I'd planned for her, I'm afraid my pride got in the way. It was unforgivable." Rose listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When the tea arrived, Eleanor immediately began correcting Rose's grip on the teacup. "No, dear, pinky in and saucer closer to the table. A lady must always maintain proper etiquette." Henry noticed Rose's shoulders tensing with each instruction. He watched as Eleanor continued to critique everything from Rose's posture to the way she placed her napkin, each comment delivered with the sharp precision of a teacher correcting a student. "Rose's artwork was recently displayed in a local gallery," Henry interjected, trying to steer the conversation toward something positive. Eleanor's expression tightened. "Yes, I heard. Though perhaps we should focus on more practical pursuits. The art world can be so unreliable." She said this while glancing meaningfully at Rose, who shrunk further into her chair. "I like art," Rose said softly but firmly. "Mom liked it too." "And look where that led her," Eleanor replied, her words cutting through the air like ice. The moment she said it, regret flashed across her face, but the damage was done. Rose's eyes welled with tears. Henry placed a protective hand on her shoulder, ready to end the meeting right then, but Rose surprised them both by speaking up. "My mom made beautiful things," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "She made people happy with her art. I want to do that too." Eleanor's facade cracked slightly, revealing a flicker of the pain she'd carried for years. "I just want what's best for you, dear, to protect you from the struggles your mother faced." "I think we've had enough for today," Henry said firmly, noting Rose's distress. As they stood to leave, Eleanor pressed a small package into Rose's hands, old photos of her mother as a child. The drive home was quiet, Rose clutching the package of photos while staring out the window. When they finally pulled into their driveway, she turned to Henry with uncertain eyes. "She's my grandmother," Rose said slowly, "but she doesn't feel like family. Not like—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Henry gently lifted her chin. "Family isn't just about who we're related to, Rose. It's about who loves us and accepts us for who we are. Never forget that." The gallery buzzed with excitement as people admired the artwork on display. Rose stood nervously beside Henry, tugging at the sleeve of her best dress while watching visitors examine her painting. The piece showed a garden bursting with wildflowers, with two figures sitting on a bench, one tall and distinguished, the other small and bright-eyed. "Everyone loves your work," Henry said softly, his usual stern expression softened by pride. The gallery owner, Mr. Peterson, had placed Rose's painting in a prime spot, where the evening light caught the vibrant colors perfectly. "Do you really think so?" Rose whispered, pressing closer to Henry's side as another group of visitors approached her painting. Mr. Peterson walked over, beaming. "Rose, your piece is getting wonderful attention. Several people have asked about the artist." He turned to Henry. "You must be very proud." Before Henry could respond, a familiar voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere. "Indeed, artistic talent runs in our family." Rose stiffened as Eleanor approached, dressed impeccably in an expensive suit. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention, but there was something different in her manner tonight, a determination that made Henry uneasy. "I didn't know you were coming," Rose said quietly, unconsciously stepping closer to Henry. Eleanor's smile remained fixed. "I wouldn't miss my granddaughter's debut." She paused, surveying the gallery with a critical eye. "In fact, this has made me realize something important. Rose needs proper cultivation of her talent." Henry felt a chill run down his spine as Eleanor continued. "I've been thinking about our family's legacy. I have the resources to provide Rose with the finest art education, the best opportunities." She turned to face Henry directly. "I want Rose to come live with me permanently." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Rose's hand found Henry's and gripped it tightly. "This isn't the time or place for such discussions," Henry said firmly, conscious of the other gallery patrons nearby. "On the contrary," Eleanor pressed. "Seeing Rose's talent on display has made it clear. She needs the advantages only I can provide. Private art tutors, the finest schools, connections in the art world." Henry excused himself and Rose, guiding her toward Mr. Peterson, who was calling her over to meet some art enthusiasts. Once Rose was safely engaged in conversation, Henry turned back to Eleanor, gesturing for her to follow him to a quiet corner of the gallery. "What are you doing?" he demanded in a low voice, his judicial demeanor barely containing his anger. "You can't just walk in here and upend Rose's life." Eleanor drew herself up. "I'm her grandmother. I have a responsibility to provide what's best for her." "What's best for her?" Henry's voice was tight with emotion. "She needs stability, Eleanor. Love. A home where she feels safe and accepted, not a showcase for your social ambitions." "You don't understand," Eleanor said, her composed facade cracking slightly. "My daughter, Rose's mother, she made me promise. Before everything fell apart, she made me promise to take care of Rose if anything happened." "And where were you when Rose needed that care?" Henry challenged. "Where were you when she was hungry and alone?" Eleanor flinched. "I was wrong to stay away, I know that now, but I have to honor my daughter's wishes. I have to make things right." "By tearing Rose away from the only stable home she's known?" Henry shook his head. "She's not a possession to be claimed, Eleanor. She's a child who needs consistency and unconditional love." Later that evening, back at Henry's house, Rose sat cross-legged on her bed, clutching her favorite sketchbook. Her small fingers traced the outline of a drawing she'd made of Henry's house, complete with the flowering bushes they'd planted together in the front yard. "Judge Whitaker?" she called out softly, knowing he was just outside her door. Henry appeared in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Is everything okay, Rose?" he asked, hovering uncertainly at the threshold. Rose's lower lip trembled slightly. Would you let me go? If Eleanor wants to take me?" Henry's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of her bed, maintaining the respectful distance he always did, despite wanting to comfort her. "Rose," he began, choosing his words carefully, "what matters most is what's best for you. As your temporary guardian, my job is to make sure you're safe and happy. But do you want me to stay?" Her eyes searched his face, desperate for reassurance. Henry struggled with his response, knowing his position as a judge required maintaining professional boundaries. What I want is for you to be where you feel most loved and secure." Eleanor's invitation came the next morning via a formal letter delivered to Henry's office. The heavy cream-colored stationery carried her request for Rose to spend a weekend at her estate, complete with detailed plans for art lessons and cultural activities. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," Henry told Rose as she read the letter at the kitchen table. Rose folded the letter carefully, her small hands smoothing the creases. Maybe I should see what it's like," she said quietly. "But you'll come get me if I want to come home?" Henry nodded, noting how she'd called his house home. Anytime, day or night. That Saturday morning, Eleanor's sleek black car pulled up to Henry's house. Rose clutched her overnight bag tightly, her other hand holding onto Henry's sleeve until the last possible moment. Eleanor's estate was everything Rose had imagined and more. The sprawling mansion sat on manicured grounds, with perfectly trimmed hedges and elaborate fountains. Inside, marble floors echoed under Rose's feet as Eleanor led her through room after immaculate room. "This will be your room," Eleanor announced, opening double doors to reveal a spacious bedroom with hand-painted murals on the walls. "It was your mother's when she was your age." Rose stepped inside, her eyes wide. Everything was beautiful but untouchable, like a museum. On the dresser sat a collection of framed photographs. Rose moved closer, her breath catching as she recognized her mother's young face smiling back at her. "She was quite the artist even then," Eleanor said, picking up one of the frames. These are some of her early sketches. Rose's fingers ghosted over the glass, tracing her mother's signature. The connection she felt was immediate and overwhelming, but also tinged with sadness. The room held so many memories of her mother, but they felt frozen in time, preserved behind glass and perfect walls. As evening fell, Rose sat on the window seat of her mother's old room, watching shadows stretch across the immaculate lawn. Everything in Eleanor's house was perfect. The expensive furniture, the formal dining room where they'd eaten dinner in silence, the art studio Eleanor had shown her with its unused supplies still in their packaging. But Rose found herself missing the warm chaos of Henry's kitchen, the comfortable couch where they read together, and the way he always seemed to know when she needed space or comfort. Henry sat in his office late one evening, surrounded by stacks of financial records and legal documents. His usually neat desk was cluttered with papers, all related to Eleanor's sudden reappearance in Rose's life. Something about the timing hadn't felt right, and his years as a judge had taught him to trust his instincts. "There has to be more here," he muttered, adjusting his reading glasses as he pored over another document. The courthouse was quiet except for the distant hum of the cleaning equipment. Maria appeared in his doorway, pushing her cart laden with cleaning supplies. "Judge Whittaker? It's past 9, she said, concern evident in her voice. "You're still here?" Henry rubbed his tired eyes. "Maria, I need your perspective on something." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Maria settled into the chair, her wise eyes taking in the scattered papers. "This is about Rose's grandmother, isn't it?" "Look at this," Henry said, sliding several documents across the desk. "Eleanor's company filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago. She's been selling off assets, and there are multiple liens against her properties." Maria leaned forward, studying the papers. "And you think this has something to do with Rose?" "Rose's mother left behind a substantial trust fund," Henry explained, his voice tight with concern. "It's meant for Rose's education and care, but there's a clause that grants limited access to her legal guardian for immediate needs." "And you believe Eleanor wants custody to access this money?" Maria's expression darkened. Henry stood up and began pacing. The timing is too convenient. She shows up right when her company is failing, suddenly interested in the granddaughter she's ignored for years. "But you can't prove it," Maria said softly. "No, I can't." Henry stopped at his window, staring out at the city lights. "And as a judge, I'm bound by legal procedures. I can't let my personal feelings interfere." Maria stood and walked over to him. "Judge Whittaker, sometimes doing what's right means fighting for it, even when the path isn't clear. That little girl needs someone in her corner." Henry nodded, gathering the documents into a folder. "Thank you, Maria. I know what I need to do." The next morning, Henry arranged to meet Eleanor at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. She arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always. "What's this about, Henry?" she asked, settling into her seat with practiced grace. Henry placed the folder on the table between them. "I think we need to discuss your sudden interest in Rose's welfare." Eleanor's perfectly composed expression flickered slightly. "I don't appreciate what you're implying." "Your company filed for bankruptcy," Henry said quietly but firmly. "You're facing multiple creditors, and your assets are being liquidated." "How dare you investigate me?" Eleanor hissed, her facade cracking. "My relationship with my granddaughter is none of your concern." "It became my concern the moment Rose came into my courtroom," Henry replied, his voice steady but intense. "And it's my concern that you seem to have appeared right when you're in desperate need of funds." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "My financial situation is temporary, but that has nothing to do with wanting to know my granddaughter." "The trust fund your daughter left for Rose," Henry pressed, "would solve your immediate problems, wouldn't it?" "You're overstepping, Judge Whittaker," Eleanor snapped, but her voice wavered. "Yes, I've had some setbacks, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm Rose's only living relative." "Blood doesn't automatically grant rights," Henry said, leaning forward. "Rose needs stability and genuine love, not someone looking to use her for financial gain." Rose pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door of Henry's study, her heart pounding as she listened to the heated voices inside. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when she heard her name, she couldn't help herself. "She's not some asset you can claim when it's convenient," Henry's voice thundered, unusually sharp with anger. "How dare you suggest I don't care about my own granddaughter?" Eleanor shot back, her words clipped and cold. Rose's hands trembled as she backed away from the door. Everything felt wrong. The arguing voices, the tension in the air, the way they talked about her like she wasn't even there. Her eyes darted to her backpack, still packed from her weekend at Eleanor's estate. Without thinking, she grabbed it and her art supplies. The front door clicked shut softly behind her as she slipped out into the afternoon sun. Tears blurred her vision as she walked quickly down the familiar streets, clutching her sketchbook to her chest like a shield. The gallery wasn't far. She'd memorized the route since her first visit. The bell above the door chimed as Rose entered the quiet space. The gallery owner, Ms. Chen, looked up from her desk with surprise. "Rose? Sweetie, what are you doing here alone?" Rose's lower lip trembled. Can I stay here for a while? Please? I need to draw." Ms. Chen's kind eyes took in Rose's tear-stained face and trembling hands. She nodded slowly, understanding in her expression. "Of course. Your usual spot by the window is free." Rose settled into the corner where she'd spent many afternoons sketching. The familiar smell of paint and canvas surrounded her like a warm blanket. She opened her sketchbook and let her emotions flow onto the paper, dark, angry lines gradually giving way to softer shapes. Ms. Chen watched her for a few minutes before quietly picking up the phone. An hour later, the gallery door burst open. Henry stood there, his tie askew and face flushed from running. When he spotted Rose, the tension in his shoulders visibly eased. "Rose," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. Rose looked up from her drawing, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I heard you and Eleanor fighting about me." Henry crossed the gallery slowly, as if afraid she might bolt. He knelt beside her chair. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that." "Everyone keeps deciding what's best for me," Rose said, her voice small but determined. "Eleanor wants me to live with her, but I don't want to go. I don't want to leave you." Henry's eyes softened as he looked at Rose's drawing, a picture of himself and Rose in front of his house, surrounded by her artwork on the walls. "This is our home," Rose whispered, pointing to the drawing. "Not Eleanor's big empty house. You're my family now." Henry gently took Rose's hand in his. "Listen to me, Rose. I promise you, I will fight for you with everything I have. You're not just a responsibility to me anymore. You're my family too." Rose threw her arms around Henry's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "Promise you won't let them take me away?" "I promise," Henry said firmly, holding her close. "We're in this together no matter what." Ms. Chen quietly wiped away a tear as she watched them embrace, the afternoon sun streaming through the gallery windows, painting them in warm, golden light. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as Henry straightened his tie and looked down at Rose. She sat beside him in her best dress, her small hands clutching her latest sketchbook. The familiar courtroom felt different today. Instead of presiding from the bench, Henry found himself on the other side, fighting for what mattered most. Eleanor sat across the aisle, her expensive suit and perfect posture radiating confidence. Her lawyer shuffled through papers, occasionally whispering in her ear. The sight made Henry's stomach twist, but he forced himself to remain calm for Rose's sake. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. As the custody hearing began, Eleanor's lawyer presented their case first. "Your Honor, my client is Rose's only living blood relative. As her maternal grandmother, she has a natural right to raise her granddaughter and continue her daughter's legacy." Henry watched as Eleanor took the stand, her voice steady and practiced. "I loved my daughter dearly, and I see so much of her in Rose. I can provide her with the best education, opportunities, and the lifestyle she deserves. It's what her mother would have wanted." When it was Henry's turn, his lawyer called Maria to the stand first. The kind-hearted janitor spoke with conviction, her words carrying the weight of genuine observation. "I've watched Judge Whitaker change since Rose came into his life. Maria testified, smiling warmly at them both. That little girl brought light into his world, and he's given her something she desperately needed, a real home filled with love. Ms. Chen testified next, describing how Henry had supported Rose's artistic talents. He comes to every exhibition, helps her set up her displays, and celebrates every small achievement. That's what a real parent does. When Henry took the stand, he spoke from his heart. Your Honor, when Rose first burst into my courtroom that day, I was a different person. I lived behind walls built from years of guilt and loss. But Rose... His voice cracked slightly. Rose taught me what it means to be a family. We've built a life together, and while I may not be her biological relative, I love her as my own daughter. Rose sat straighter in her chair, tears glistening in her eyes as she listened to Henry's words. Eleanor's lawyer cross-examined Henry sharply. Isn't it true that you were involved in sentencing Rose's father to prison? How can you claim to have her best interests at heart when you played a role in breaking apart her original family? Henry took a deep breath. I sentenced her father according to the law, as was my duty. But now my duty, my privilege, is to be the parent Rose needs. I'm not perfect, but I learn and grow every day because of her. Judge Martinez listened intently to all testimony, her expression neutral. After both sides presented their cases, she leaned forward in her chair. This is not a decision to be made lightly, she announced. While biological connections carry weight, the court must consider what arrangement will best serve Rose's well-being and development. I will review all evidence carefully before making my final ruling next week. As they left the courthouse, Rose slipped her hand into Henry's. Despite the uncertainty hanging over them, their steps fell in sync as they walked down the familiar stone steps. You did great in there, Henry said softly, squeezing her hand. Rose looked up at him with trust in her eyes. We both did, she replied, holding her sketchbook close with her free hand. We're still together, right? Always, Henry assured her, his voice firm with conviction. No matter what happens next week, we're in this together. That evening, the house felt different, warmer somehow despite the autumn chill creeping in through the windows. Henry stood at the kitchen counter, mechanically going through the motions of making hot chocolate, while Rose sat at the table working on a new drawing. The scratching of her colored pencils filled the comfortable silence between them. Here you go, Henry said, placing a steaming mug decorated with dancing bears in front of Rose. She had picked it out herself during one of their weekend shopping trips, and it had quickly become her favorite. Thanks, Rose smiled, wrapping her small hands around the warm ceramic. She studied Henry's face for a moment, gathering courage. Can I ask you something? Henry settled into the chair across from her, his own mug sending wisps of steam into the air. Of course. Earlier today in court, you mentioned guilt about losing someone, Rose said softly. Was that about your sister? Henry's hands tightened around his mug. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken memories. After a long moment, he nodded. Her name was Sarah, he began, his voice rough with emotion. She was a lot like you, actually. Creative, full of life, always trying to make people smile. He paused, taking a shaky breath. We were very close growing up, but as adults, I got caught up in my career and building my reputation as a judge. I started missing her calls, canceling our weekly dinners. Rose listened intently, her drawing forgotten. Henry had never opened up like this before. The night of the accident, he continued, she had called asking for a ride home from a late art class. I was preparing for an important case the next day, told her to take a taxi instead. His voice cracked. The taxi driver fell asleep at the wheel. Sarah didn't make it. It wasn't your fault, Rose said quietly, reaching across the table to place her small hand over his. Henry's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I've carried that guilt for so long, thrown myself into work, shut everyone out. But then you burst into my courtroom that day. He managed a weak smile. It felt like life giving me a second chance. A chance to be there for someone who needed me, to honor Sarah's memory by being the kind of person she always believed I could be. Rose got up from her chair and walked around the table, wrapping her arms around Henry's neck in a tight hug. "You're not just someone who's there for me," she whispered. "You're the dad I always wished for." Henry's arms came around her, holding her close as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. They stayed like that for a long moment, their hot chocolate growing cold, sharing the kind of healing that only love could bring. Later that night, as Henry tucked Rose into bed, she looked up at him with eyes full of trust and affection. "I'm glad you told me about Sarah," she said sleepily. "I think she'd be proud of you." Henry smoothed her hair back from her forehead, his heart full to bursting. "I'll never let you go," he whispered, meaning every word with everything he had. "Promise?" Rose asked, already drifting off to sleep. "Promise," Henry replied softly, watching as his daughter, for that's truly what she was now, fell asleep with a peaceful smile on her face. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Eleanor's surprise witness took the stand. Mrs. Peterson, Rose's former foster mother, smoothed her perfectly pressed skirt and adjusted her glasses. Judge Whittaker was cold, dismissive when he first encountered Rose, Mrs. Peterson stated, her voice sharp. He tried to have her removed from his courtroom that day. Is that the behavior of someone fit to be a parent? Henry's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. His attorney stood, addressing Mrs. Peterson. "And where were you when Rose was so hungry she had to run away?" Mrs. Peterson flushed. "We did our best with limited resources." Eleanor sat with a satisfied smile, but it faded as Henry's attorney called the gallery owner to the stand. He brought with him several of Rose's paintings, displaying them for the court. "These works show remarkable growth," the gallery owner explained, gesturing to the vibrant canvases. "They tell the story of a child who feels safe, loved, and supported in her creativity." Maria testified next, describing the transformation she'd witnessed. "Judge Whittaker may have started out stern, but that little girl melted his heart. I've watched him learn to be the father she needs." When Rose took the stand, the courtroom grew still. She wore her best dress, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "How do you feel living with Judge Whittaker?" the attorney asked gently. "He makes me feel safe," Rose said, her voice clear and steady. "He helps me with homework, comes to all my art shows, and—" She paused, glancing at Henry. "He never forgets to check under my bed for monsters, even though he's really tired after work." Eleanor's confident expression wavered as she watched the judge's face soften at Rose's words. The judge leaned forward in his chair. "I've heard compelling arguments from both sides. Before making my final decision, I believe it's essential to see firsthand the environments both parties can provide." He looked between Henry and Eleanor. "I will conduct home visits to both residences within the next week to observe the living situations and interactions personally." Henry nodded solemnly while Eleanor clutched her designer handbag tighter, her knuckles white with tension. "Court is adjourned until the completion of these visits," the judge announced, his gavel echoing through the now silent courtroom. As they stood to leave, Rose slipped her small hand into Henry's, squeezing it tight. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor, whose determined expression hardened as she watched them walk away. The judge's car pulled up to Eleanor's sprawling estate, its manicured lawns and pristine gardens stretching as far as the eye could see. Rose stood beside Eleanor on the grand marble steps, wearing a stiff new dress that Eleanor had bought specially for the occasion. "Welcome to our home," Eleanor announced proudly, gesturing at the imposing mansion. The judge nodded, making notes on a small pad while taking in the perfectly maintained facade. Inside, their footsteps echoed through the vast foyer, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and gleaming marble floors. Eleanor led them on a tour, pointing out antique furniture and priceless artwork with practiced precision. "This would be Rose's room," Eleanor said, opening double doors to reveal a pink and white bedroom that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "I've had it professionally decorated to suit a young lady." Rose touched the silk bedspread hesitantly. Everything was perfect, too perfect. Not a single thing looked lived in or loved. The judge watched as Rose's shoulders tensed, her small frame seeming to shrink in the enormous space. "Would you like to show me your artwork here, Rose?" the judge asked kindly. Eleanor jumped in before Rose could answer. "I've arranged for the finest art tutors to come 3 times a week. We'll have a proper studio set up in the East Wing." I usually just draw wherever I feel comfortable," Rose said quietly, fidgeting with the hem of her new dress. During lunch in the formal dining room, Eleanor repeatedly corrected Rose's posture and table manners. "Elbows off the table, dear. Small bites. A young lady must learn proper etiquette." Rose's movements became increasingly mechanical as she tried to follow Eleanor's constant stream of instructions. The judge noticed how the girl's eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. In an attempt to connect, Eleanor brought out old photo albums of Rose's mother. "She was so talented, just like you," Eleanor said, but her voice carried a hint of rehearsed emotion. "We'll make sure you live up to her potential." Rose nodded politely, but her usual spark was missing. When Eleanor stepped away to take a phone call about her investment portfolio, Rose slumped in her chair, exhaustion clear on her face. Later that afternoon, back at Henry's modest house, Rose sat at the familiar kitchen table while Henry made her favorite hot chocolate. The tension seemed to melt from her shoulders as soon as she walked through the door. "Grandma Eleanor's house is beautiful," Rose said carefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "She has everything anybody could want." Henry sat beside her, waiting patiently as she gathered her thoughts. "But," Rose's voice wavered, "it doesn't feel like home. Everything's so fancy I'm scared to touch anything. And Grandma Eleanor keeps talking about making me into a proper lady, but..." She looked down at her chocolate. "I just want to be me." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Is that wrong? Should I want to live in a big house with fancy things?" Henry handed her a napkin. "There's nothing wrong with how you feel, Rose." "At Grandma Eleanor's I have to be perfect all the time," Rose whispered. "I miss your messy kitchen and the way you let me hang my drawings everywhere, even if they're not straight. I miss being able to paint without worrying about getting spots on the carpet." She wiped her eyes. "I know she's trying, but it doesn't feel like she wants me. It feels like she wants the idea of me." The next morning, the judge's car pulled up to Henry's modest suburban home. Unlike Eleanor's imposing mansion, Henry's house welcomed visitors with cheerful flower boxes and a slightly crooked welcome mat that Rose had picked out herself. Maria and the gallery owner were already waiting on the front porch, having arrived early to support Henry and Rose. The morning sun cast a warm glow across the lived-in space, highlighting children's drawings taped to the windows. "Your Honor," Maria greeted warmly, "I've worked at the courthouse for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone change as much as Henry has since Rose came into his life." The gallery owner nodded in agreement. "The transformation has been remarkable. Henry comes to every art show now, standing proudly beside Rose as she explains her work to visitors." Inside, the house told its own story. Where Eleanor's mansion had felt like a museum, Henry's home buzzed with life. Rose's artwork covered the walls. Some pieces hung crookedly, others taped up with bright construction paper frames. Crayon drawings shared space with watercolor paintings, creating a rainbow of creativity throughout the house. "This is my favorite spot," Rose announced, leading the judge to a corner of the living room where an old easel stood next to a comfortable armchair. "Henry sits there and reads while I paint. Sometimes he falls asleep, but that's okay because I like drawing him that way too." The judge smiled, noting how Rose moved confidently through the space, completely at ease. In the kitchen, evidence of shared meals and cooking lessons filled the counters. A recipe book with both Henry and Rose's handwriting. A stepping stool by the sink where they did dishes together. "Rose insisted on learning to cook," Henry explained, a hint of pride in his voice. "We've had some interesting experiments, but we're getting better." Rose giggled. "Remember the purple pancakes?" "How could I forget?" Henry ruffled her hair affectionately. "Though I maintain that food shouldn't be that color." The judge watched their easy interaction, so different from the formal exchanges at Eleanor's estate. As they moved upstairs, Rose eagerly showed off her bedroom. Unlike the designer showcase at Eleanor's, this room clearly belonged to a real child. Art supplies were organized in recycled jars, paintings covered the walls, and a handmade quilt, a gift from Maria, spread across the bed. Henry helped me pick the colors, Rose explained, pointing to the sunny yellow walls. And look! She opened her closet to reveal a makeshift gallery of her earliest drawings. He saved everything I ever made, even the bad ones. The afternoon progressed naturally, without the rigid schedule Eleanor had presented. Maria shared stories about catching Rose drawing in the courthouse corridors, and how Henry had started keeping art supplies in his chambers. The gallery owner described watching Henry learn about different art techniques, just so he could better understand Rose's passion. As evening approached, Henry and Rose prepared dinner together. The judge observed their comfortable routine, Rose setting the table while Henry checked the pasta, their conversation flowing easily between daily events and future plans. When Rose accidentally spilled her water, Henry simply handed her a towel with a gentle smile. No harsh words or corrections needed. "We're still learning," Henry admitted quietly to the judge while Rose was distracted with wiping up the spill. "But we're learning together." The simple statement carried more weight than all of Eleanor's elaborate promises. In this kitchen, with its mismatched plates and refrigerator covered in artwork, love wasn't something to be earned through proper behavior. It was given freely, unconditionally. The doorbell rang just as Henry was helping Rose with her math homework. Through the frosted glass of the front door, a familiar silhouette stood waiting. Eleanor, her normally perfect posture slightly slumped. Henry opened the door cautiously. "Eleanor, we weren't expecting you." "I needed to speak with you," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a hint of desperation that Henry had never heard before. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, a wrinkled collar, slightly smudged mascara. Henry hesitated but stepped aside to let her in. Rose looked up from her homework, her pencil frozen mid-equation. "Henry, please," Eleanor began, setting her designer purse down with trembling hands. "I know what the judge saw today, but I can provide so much more for Rose's future. Private schools, art lessons with renowned teachers, travel opportunities." "Eleanor," Henry interrupted firmly, but she continued as if she hadn't heard him. "I've already spoken with financial advisors. I can set up a trust fund, ensure she'll never want for anything." Eleanor's words tumbled out faster now. Her mother, my daughter, would have wanted her to have every advantage. From the kitchen table, Rose watched the exchange, her small fingers gripping her pencil tightly. Henry noticed her tension and moved closer to her instinctively. "Money isn't everything, Eleanor," Henry said quietly. "Rose needs stability, love, and the freedom to be herself. She needs a home, not just a house." Eleanor's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Don't you think I know that? I made mistakes with my daughter. Terrible mistakes. I was too focused on appearances, on society's expectations." She paused, blinking back tears. "This is my chance to make things right." "By doing the same things all over again?" Henry challenged gently. Rose stood up from her chair, her voice small but steady. "Grandmother?" Both adults turned to look at her. Eleanor's face softened. "Yes, dear." "I know you want to give me nice things," Rose said, moving to stand beside Henry. "But I already have everything I need here. Henry lets me paint whatever I want, even if it's messy. We cook together and sometimes burn things, but that's okay. I don't want to leave." Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders dropping. "You remind me so much of your mother," she whispered. "She used to speak her mind like that too before I—" She trailed off, looking around the modest home with new eyes. The walls covered in Rose's artwork, the mismatched cushions on the couch, the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, all signs of a life being lived, not just displayed. "I thought I could fix the past," Eleanor admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "But I'm just repeating it, aren't I?" Rose approached her grandmother slowly. "You don't have to fix anything. You can just be my grandmother if you want. We could paint together sometimes." Henry watched as Eleanor's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. She reached for her purse with shaking hands. "I should go," she said, standing up. I need to think." At the door, she turned back one last time. "You've done well with her, Henry. Better than I could have. After Eleanor left, Rose leaned against Henry's side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They stood in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun streaming through windows decorated with Rose's sun catchers, casting rainbow patterns across the floor. "Thank you for staying with me," Rose said softly. Henry squeezed her shoulder gently. "Always, kiddo. Always." The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as everyone settled into their places. Rose sat between Henry and Maria, her small hand clutching Henry's tightly. Eleanor sat at the opposite table, her posture perfect, but her fingers fidgeting with her pearl necklace. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, cleared her throat. The room fell silent. "In the matter of custody for Rose Mitchell," the judge began, her voice clear and measured, "this court has carefully considered all evidence presented, including home visits, character testimonies, and most importantly, the well-being of the child in question." Rose squeezed Henry's hand harder. He gave her a reassuring squeeze back, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Both parties have demonstrated sincere desire to provide for Rose," the judge continued. "Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell has shown her willingness to offer significant financial resources and educational opportunities. Her biological connection to Rose and her desire to honor her daughter's memory are noteworthy." Eleanor straightened in her chair, hope flickering across her face. "However," the judge paused, looking directly at Rose, "a child's well-being extends far beyond material provisions. In the months that Rose has lived with Judge Henry Whitaker, she has shown remarkable progress in both emotional stability and personal growth. The evidence of their bond is clear in every piece of artwork displayed in this courtroom, in every testimony from community members, and most significantly, in Rose's own words." Tears welled up in Rose's eyes as she looked up at Henry, who was struggling to maintain his usual composed demeanor. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court to grant full custody to Henry Whitaker, with provisions for regular visitation rights for Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, should all parties agree." The gallery owner, sitting behind them, let out a quiet, "Yes," while Maria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Henry released a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly, but she maintained her dignity. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but also a glimmer of understanding. "Furthermore," the judge added, "I want to commend both parties for their dedication to Rose's welfare. Mrs. Mitchell, your desire to reconnect with your granddaughter is admirable. I encourage you to continue building that relationship, albeit in a different capacity than you initially hoped." Rose surprised everyone by standing up. "Can I say something?" she asked quietly. The judge nodded, her expression gentle. "Of course, Rose." Rose walked over to Eleanor, her steps steady and sure. "Thank you for trying to give me a good life," she said, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. "I know you loved my mom, and you were trying to make things right. Maybe we can still get to know each other, just differently." Eleanor's carefully maintained composure cracked. She reached out and gently took Rose's hand. "I would like that very much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Henry watched the exchange, his heart swelling with pride at Rose's compassion. The gallery owner leaned forward and whispered, "That's one special kid you've got there, Henry." After the formalities were completed, Henry and Rose walked hand in hand toward the courtroom doors. Maria and the gallery owner followed, talking excitedly about celebrating later. "Ready to go home?" Henry asked, looking down at Rose. Rose beamed up at him, her eyes bright with happy tears. "We already are home," she said. "We're together." They pushed through the heavy wooden doors, stepping into the warm afternoon sunlight, their hearts light with relief and gratitude. The gallery buzzed with excitement as people gathered around the covered canvas. The space had been transformed for the evening, with soft lights casting a warm glow over the crowd. Rose stood next to Henry, wearing a new blue dress that Maria had helped her pick out. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress as she waited for the gallery owner to make the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the gallery owner began, her voice carrying across the room. "Tonight, we're privileged to showcase a remarkable piece by an extraordinary young artist. Rose's journey from hardship to hope has touched all of our hearts, and her talent speaks volumes about the resilience of the human spirit." Henry placed a reassuring hand on Rose's shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with anticipation. The gallery owner continued, "Without further ado, I present My Second Chance by Rose Mitchell Whitaker." As the cloth was pulled away, gasps of appreciation filled the room. The painting showed two figures sitting on a bench beneath a blooming cherry tree. One was clearly Henry, his usual stern expression softened into a gentle smile. Beside him sat Rose, her face tilted up toward the falling petals. The background merged from dark, shadowy colors into vibrant, hopeful hues, symbolizing their journey together. "I'd like to say something," Rose announced, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "This painting is for Henry, who showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and second chances." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When I was lost, he found me. When I was scared, he protected me. He didn't just give me a home, he gave me a father." Henry blinked rapidly, fighting back tears as several people in the crowd dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Taking the microphone, Henry cleared his throat. "Rose's courage and artistry have inspired me to do more," he announced. "Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Second Chance Foundation, dedicated to supporting foster children in pursuing their artistic dreams. Every child deserves the opportunity to express themselves and find their path, just as Rose has." The crowd erupted in applause. Maria, standing nearby, beamed with pride while wiping away tears. Later that evening, Henry's usually quiet home was filled with the warmth of celebration. Maria had outdone herself, bringing not just her famous chocolate chip cookies, but also an entire spread of homemade treats. The living room, once stark and formal, now hummed with conversation and laughter. Rose's artwork adorned the walls, transforming the space into a gallery of their shared journey. The gallery owner chatted excitedly with other art enthusiasts about Rose's potential, while Maria told stories about how she'd watched their relationship bloom at the courthouse. In a quiet moment, Rose found Henry standing by the fireplace, looking at her painting which now hung above it. "You know," she said, slipping her small hand into his, "you didn't just save me, you made me whole." Henry knelt down to her level, his eyes glistening. "Rose, you did the same for me. I was incomplete before you burst into my courtroom that day." Maria appeared with a fresh plate of cookies, her face glowing with happiness. "Look at you two," she said warmly. "Who would have thought that stern old Judge Whitaker would end up with such a wonderful daughter?" Rose giggled and grabbed a cookie while Henry pretended to look offended at being called stern old Judge Whitaker. The sound of their laughter mixed with the joyful chatter of their guests, filling every corner of what had once been a lonely house with the unmistakable warmth of home. In his home office, Henry sat surrounded by stacks of paperwork, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the foundation's initial proposals. The morning sun streamed through the window, highlighting the colorful drawings Rose had taped to his previously bare walls. Each piece of artwork served as a reminder of why he was embarking on this new chapter. Maria knocked on the doorframe, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I brought your favorite," she said, setting one down beside him. "How's the planning coming along?" "There's so much to consider," Henry replied, rubbing his temples, "but I think we're onto something special with the art therapy program." The gallery owner, Sarah Matthews, arrived shortly after, carrying a portfolio filled with program outlines. "I've contacted several local artists who are eager to volunteer," she announced, spreading the documents across Henry's desk, "and I've secured a space next to the gallery that we can convert into a studio for the children." Rose peeked into the office, her face lighting up at the sight of everyone gathered. "Can I help?" she asked, stepping inside. "I've been thinking about how to teach the younger kids. Sometimes it's hard to talk about feelings, but drawing them is easier." Henry smiled warmly at his daughter. "That's exactly what we want to achieve, sweetheart. Would you like to be our first junior art instructor?" Rose nodded enthusiastically. "I could show them how I started, with just pencils and paper." You don't need fancy stuff to make something beautiful. Maria reached out and squeezed Rose's shoulder. That's perfect, honey. Sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference. Over the next few weeks, the foundation began taking shape. Henry transformed his rigid courtroom approach into compassionate leadership, working tirelessly to create something meaningful. The art studio space slowly came alive with easels, art supplies, and child-sized furniture. Rose spent hours helping to decorate the walls with encouraging messages and example artwork. On the day of the foundation's inaugural meeting, the studio was packed with supporters, social workers, and potential volunteers. Children from local foster homes sat cross-legged on colorful cushions, their eyes wide with curiosity. Rose stood proudly next to a display of her artwork, answering questions and encouraging shy children to try picking up a pencil. Henry approached the podium, adjusting his tie nervously. The room fell quiet as he cleared his throat. "A year ago, I was a different man," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw the world in black and white, right and wrong. Then a brave little girl burst into my courtroom, hungry and alone, and showed me that life is painted in every color imaginable." He paused, looking at Rose, who beamed back at him. "This foundation isn't just about providing art supplies or lessons. It's about giving children the tools to express their hearts when words fail them. It's about showing them that their stories matter, that their pain can be transformed into something beautiful." "My daughter Rose," he continued, pride evident in his voice, "taught me that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents. It's created through love, understanding, and sometimes a simple act of opening your heart to possibilities you never imagined." Maria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Sarah nodded encouragingly from the side of the room. The children listened intently, some already sketching in the notebooks they'd been given. "The Second Chance Foundation," Henry declared, "is more than a charity. It's a promise to every child who feels lost or voiceless. Through art, through compassion, and through community, we can help them find their way home, just as Rose helped me find mine." Eleanor stood in the foundation's art studio doorway, her usually confident posture betraying a hint of uncertainty. The morning light filtered through the large windows, illuminating the colorful artwork that covered the walls. Henry looked up from his desk, surprised to see her there. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Eleanor said, her voice softer than usual. She clutched her designer handbag like a shield. "About Rose, about everything." Henry gestured for her to sit, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "What's on your mind, Eleanor?" "I want to help," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a checkbook. "Not to buy forgiveness or favor, but because it's the right thing to do. I was wrong before thinking I could just sweep in and claim Rose because of blood ties." Henry studied her face, noting the genuine remorse in her eyes. "This isn't about money, Eleanor." "I know that now," she replied, her voice cracking slightly. "I watched you with her at the custody hearing. The way she looks at you, that's real love. I was foolish to think I could replace that with wealth and status." From the adjoining room, they could hear Rose's voice as she helped younger children with their art projects. The sound made Eleanor's eyes mist over. "I'd like to be part of her life," Eleanor continued. "On her terms, of course. Perhaps I could volunteer here. Learn to understand her world better." Henry leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Rose is very perceptive. She'll know if you're not genuine." "I understand," Eleanor nodded. "That's why I want to start small. Maybe just sitting in on some art sessions, getting to know her in her element." Maria, who had been arranging supplies nearby, stepped forward. "We could always use more helping hands," she offered kindly, especially someone with experience in managing resources. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor became a regular presence at the foundation. She started by simply observing, watching Rose guide younger children through their art projects. Her designer suits were gradually replaced by more practical clothing, often spotted with paint by day's end. One quiet afternoon, while most of the children had gone home, Rose sat at an easel working on a new painting. Eleanor hesitated before approaching, carrying her own blank canvas. "Would it be all right if I painted with you?" she asked softly. Rose looked up, studying her grandmother's face. After a moment, she nodded and moved over to make space. They worked in comfortable silence, brush strokes filling their canvases with color. "I like how you've changed," Rose said suddenly, not looking up from her work. "You're different now." Eleanor's hand paused mid-stroke. "Different how?" "You smile more. Real smiles, not the fancy ones you used to wear." Rose dipped her brush in blue paint. "And you actually look at my art, not just pretend to." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm sorry for how I acted before, Rose. I was scared of losing my last connection to your mother, but I went about it all wrong." Rose put down her brush and turned to face her grandmother. Her eyes held wisdom beyond her years. "I don't hate you," she said simply. "I just needed time to feel safe." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They returned to their paintings, working side by side in the warm afternoon light, each stroke bringing them closer to understanding. Rose stood in front of the mirror, fidgeting with the new dress Eleanor had bought her for the exhibition. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the fabric, her mind racing with doubts about the upcoming show. "What if nobody likes my paintings?" she whispered to herself, biting her lower lip. Henry appeared in the doorway, his usually stern face softened with pride. "Rose, come here for a minute," he called gently. She patted over to him and he knelt down to meet her eyes. "Do you remember that first drawing you gave me? The one of my sister?" Rose nodded, managing a small smile. "That drawing changed everything," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "It opened my heart when I thought it was locked forever. Your art has that power, Rose. It speaks to people." Maria bustled into the room carrying a box of Rose's newest paintings. "He's right, Pequeña," she said warmly. "Your paintings tell stories that need to be heard." Over the next few days, the gallery buzzed with activity as they prepared for the exhibition. Eleanor proved surprisingly helpful with the arrangements, her business experience coming in handy as she organized the catering and publicity. Rose watched in amazement as her artwork was carefully hung on the pristine walls. Each piece told a part of her journey, from the dark, lonely days in foster care to the warmth of finding her new family. The gallery owner had suggested arranging them chronologically, creating a visual story of hope and healing. "Look at this one," Eleanor said softly, standing before a painting of a courthouse. "You've captured exactly how it felt that day, both scary and full of possibility." Rose leaned against her grandmother's side. "I was so hungry and afraid," she admitted. "But that's where I found Henry." On the evening of the exhibition, the gallery filled with people from all walks of life. Rose's art therapy students came with their parents, proudly pointing out the pieces they'd watched her create. Local art critics mingled with social workers and foster care advocates, all drawn by the young artist's story. Henry stood at the podium, clearing his throat to address the crowd. "A year ago, my life was very different," he began. "I was a judge who thought he knew everything about justice. Then a brave little girl burst into my courtroom and taught me what true justice means: love, second chances, and the courage to change." Rose stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite her nervousness. "These paintings are my story," she said, gesturing to the walls around them. "But they're also the story of everyone who helped me find my way home." She pointed to a large canvas near the center of the room, showing 3 figures surrounding a smaller one, each painted in vibrant, hopeful colors. "This one is called My Family," she explained. "It shows how Henry taught me to trust again, how Maria showed me kindness when I needed it most, and how Eleanor learned that love is better than pride." Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she watched her granddaughter speak. Maria squeezed Henry's hand, both of them beaming with pride. "These people gave me more than a home," Rose continued, her voice growing stronger. "They gave me hope. They showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you even when it's hard. They're the family who gave me hope." The audience wiped away tears as Rose finished speaking, her words touching something deep and true in their hearts. Her paintings seemed to glow in the gallery lights, each one a testament to the power of love and second chances. Snow drifted lazily past the windows of Henry's house. which had transformed from its once sterile state into a warm haven of creativity and love. Colorful paper chains, crafted by Rose's careful hands, draped across the mantelpiece while her paintings adorned every wall. The Christmas tree sparkled with a mix of store-bought ornaments and handmade creations. Pine cones painted in bright colors, paper stars, and small canvases featuring tiny winter scenes. Henry stood in the kitchen, attempting to follow Maria's cookie recipe. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air as Rose perched on a stool nearby, giggling at his serious expression while he measured ingredients. "You're supposed to cream the butter first, Henry," Rose instructed, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "That's what Maria always says." Henry furrowed his brow at the mixer. "I thought I was doing that," he muttered, making Rose laugh harder. The doorbell chimed and Maria burst in, bringing with her the warmth of fresh-baked bread and the sharp cold of winter air. "Feliz Navidad," she called out, her arms laden with bags of food and gifts. "Maria!" Rose jumped down from her stool and rushed to hug her, nearly knocking over a bag of flour in her excitement. "Careful, pequeña," Maria laughed, setting down her packages. She took one look at Henry's baking attempt and shook her head with a smile. Judge Whitaker, what are you doing to those poor cookies?" Before Henry could defend himself, the doorbell rang again. Rose opened it to find Eleanor standing there, elegant as always, but with a softer expression than usual. She carried a large, carefully wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," Eleanor said, stepping inside and brushing snow from her coat. Her eyes took in the decorated house with appreciation. "The house looks beautiful, Rose. Your artwork makes everything come alive." Rose helped Eleanor with her coat, their movements more comfortable with each other now, though still careful. The large package drew Rose's curious gaze, but she waited patiently as Eleanor settled in. Maria brought out hot chocolate for everyone, serving it in mismatched mugs that Rose had painted herself. The group gathered in the living room, where a fire crackled merrily in the fireplace. "I have something special for you," Eleanor said to Rose, bringing forward the package. "I've been working on this for months." Rose carefully unwrapped the gift, gasping softly as she revealed a stunning portrait. In it, a young woman with Rose's same wild curls and bright eyes smiled from the canvas, her face alive with joy and creativity. "Your mother," Eleanor explained, her voice gentle. "I painted this from my favorite photograph of her. She was about your age when I took it, just starting to discover her love of art." Tears welled in Rose's eyes as she traced her fingers over the painting. Henry moved closer, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder as he too studied the image of the daughter he'd never met, the sister he'd lost too soon. "She has your smile," Maria observed softly, and Rose nodded, unable to speak. Eleanor watched her granddaughter's reaction with misty eyes. I thought you should have something of her, something that shows how much joy and beauty she brought to the world, just like you do." The snow continued to fall outside as they gathered closer to the fireplace, sharing stories and memories. Maria served her famous cookies while Rose curled up between Henry and Eleanor, the portrait of her mother watching over them all. "This isn't just a house anymore," Henry said, looking around at the transformed space filled with art, love, and family. "It's a home because of you, Rose." Henry sat in his chambers across from a young lawyer named David, who nervously twisted a case file in his hands. The afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the walls now adorned with several of Rose's paintings. "I just don't know if I'm cut out for this," David admitted, his voice heavy with doubt. "Every decision feels like it carries so much weight. How do you handle that responsibility?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to a particular painting, one of Rose's first works that showed a small figure reaching toward a bright light. "You know, I used to think being a judge was all about maintaining distance, following the letter of the law, without letting emotions cloud judgment." He smiled, remembering the day Rose burst into his courtroom. "Then a 7-year-old girl showed me I was wrong. She taught me that true justice needs both wisdom and compassion." David looked up, intrigued. Henry shared the story of how Rose transformed his life, watching understanding dawn in the young lawyer's eyes. Across town at the community center, Rose sat cross-legged on the floor beside a quiet girl named Sarah. Other children worked busily at their art stations, but Sarah hadn't touched her paintbrush. "I used to be scared to paint too," Rose said softly, picking up her own brush. "I thought I wouldn't be good enough." Sarah glanced up, her eyes curious but wary. "Really?" Rose nodded, starting to mix colors on her palette. "But then someone very special showed me that art isn't about being perfect. It's about letting your heart speak." Maria watched from nearby as Rose guided Sarah's hand to the paper, helping her make her first stroke of color. The girl's face lit up as bright blue paint spread across the white surface. "See?" Rose encouraged. "That's your voice right there, in that color." By the end of the session, Sarah had filled her paper with swirling blues and purples. As her foster mother came to pick her up, Sarah hugged Rose tightly. "Will you be here next week?" Sarah whispered. Rose squeezed her hand. "I promise, every week we artists have to stick together." That evening, the community center's main hall buzzed with excitement. Strings of lights twinkled overhead as people gathered to celebrate the foundation's first year of success. Henry's art therapy program had helped dozens of foster children, and Rose's regular classes had become the heart of the initiative. When Rose took the podium, her voice carried clearly across the hushed room. Gone was the frightened girl who had once begged for help in a courtroom. In her place stood a confident young artist, her eyes bright with purpose. "A year ago, I thought I was alone in the world," she began, looking out at the familiar faces. "But life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need, even if it comes in unexpected packages." The audience chuckled as she glanced at Henry, who pretended to look stern but couldn't hide his proud smile. "Through this foundation, we've learned that family isn't just who you're born to," Rose continued, her voice strong and clear. "It's who loves you enough to stay. And sometimes, the family you choose becomes the greatest gift of all." Sarah sat in the front row, clutching her latest painting, while Maria wiped tears from her eyes. Henry watched his daughter speak, amazed at how far they'd both come from that first desperate meeting. Henry sat at his desk in the early morning light, pen hovering over crisp paper. After a year of transforming lives through the foundation, he finally found the words he needed to write to his sister. "Dear Claire," he wrote, his usually steady hand trembling slightly. "You always said I'd find my way back to what matters. It took a little girl bursting into my courtroom to prove you right. Rose saved me from becoming exactly what I feared, cold, distant, alone, just like you tried to warn me about all those years ago." And through the window, he could hear the gentle sounds of Rose in the backyard. She had been mysteriously busy out there for days, insisting he couldn't peek until today. "I think you led her to me somehow," he continued writing. "She has your spirit, your creativity, your way of seeing beauty in broken things. Thank you for not giving up on me, even after you were gone." "Dad," Rose's excited voice called from outside. "It's ready." Henry carefully folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. When he stepped into the backyard, he stopped in his tracks, overwhelmed by what he saw. The entire back wall of the house had been transformed into a vibrant mural. Rose stood proudly before it, paint splattered on her overalls. The painting showed Henry in his judge's robes, but instead of looking stern, he was smiling, surrounded by children creating art. Rose had painted herself beside him, and Maria stood nearby with her famous cookies. Even Eleanor was there, helping a small child hold a paintbrush. "Do you like it?" Rose asked, bouncing on her toes. "I wanted to show everyone who made our family special." Henry's vision blurred with tears as he noticed one final detail. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, was Claire's smiling face watching over them all. "It's perfect," he managed to say, pulling Rose into a tight hug. "Absolutely perfect." Maria arrived with a basket of fresh cookies, gasping when she saw the mural. "Oh, mi amor," she whispered, hugging Rose. "You've captured all our hearts." Eleanor appeared shortly after, carrying art supplies. Her relationship with Rose had grown steadily over the year, built on shared creativity and genuine care rather than obligation. "Well," Eleanor said, opening a set of paints. "Shall we add some finishing touches together?" Rose's face lit up as she distributed brushes. Soon all four of them were adding small details to the mural, a butterfly here, a flower there, each contribution making the family portrait more complete. Henry watched as Rose guided Eleanor's hand to add a rainbow in the corner, their laughter mixing with the sounds of children arriving at the foundation next door. Through the fence, he could see Sarah leading a new student to the art room, her confidence growing stronger each day. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Henry and Rose, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.